Okay, welcome to this week's Haftarah, which is the Haftarah for Chukat. And I actually was trying to do some research before the class, and I couldn't figure it out, which might mean that there never was a different Haftarah for Chukat. Um, but Chukat is a super interesting chapter of the book of Shoftim, but has a pretty tame connection to the Parsha. And I was curious if there were communities that read Haftorah that might have fit some of the other components of the parsha, right? I think in Parshiot, where there's not just one theme, right? A lot of things happen in Chukat. There's the para aduma, the red heifer, which is right a chok, a law that we don't understand. There is a lot of talk about war, which is what our Haftarah touches upon. There's the death of Miriam and Aharon, and so I was surprised that the Haftarah was such a, from my opinion, humbly, it was a less interesting aspect of the parsha. It seemed to me that there might be a better, more interesting piece to look at, but it seems that everyone reads this one, right? Often there's sort of distinction. Some communities read this, some read that, and it didn't sort of even out until later, but I couldn't find any mention of that. So we're stuck with the Haftarah that we have. No special weeks Haftarah readings today. And it comes from the book of Shoftim. I don't remember if we have looked at Shoftim before. Shoftim is the second book of the Navi, right? Yehoshua is first, and then Shoftim is second. And Shoftim, as we talked about a little bit last week, is this period of instability in the history of Bnei Israel, right? So from Moshe's leadership and the desert, we go into Yehoshua's leadership in conquering the land of Israel. And then Shoftim is a period in which there are rulers, a series of rulers with no clear succession plan. Some of them are better than others, and Yiftach is a really complicated one. And it's not until we get to Shmuel Aleph, which is what we looked at last week, which is when Shmuel, somewhat reluctantly, towards the beginning of the Sefer, appoints the first king, Shaul. So from there, we get off and running in a series of kingships, not always stable and not always smooth succession plans, but at least that's sort of the goal of the kingship. And Rav Moshe Lichtenstein makes a distinction between the first half of Shoftim and the second half, and our Haftarah falls smack in the middle. There are 20 prakim, and this is Perek 11, is Perek Yud Aleph, but it's part of the it starts in Perek Yud. So Yiftach's story, he is sort of the bridge in between the first section and the second section. So what Rav Lichtenstein says is that the first section is not really pure judges or shoftim, leaders, but they're what he calls deliverers. They're great generals. They're able to deliver the thing that Bnei Israel needs at that moment, but they don't display really strong leadership characteristics. And after Yiftach, we move, or perhaps somewhere in the middle of Yiftach, we move into this other model where there's a stronger leadership model, even if it's not the kingship that the monarchy that Bnei Israel desire. So that's where we find ourselves in this week's Haftarah. And what I want to do first is look at I think like the very practical connection to the Parsha, but there is also the beginning of a very difficult story. And so I want to look at that at least a little bit before we part ways today. So let me share my screen here.
Turn the light on, too. Just to the first one.
Okay, here we go. So this is Haftarah Chukat from Shoftim, and this first part, and it's a big block of text, but it seems that Yiftach is actually is referencing our parsha, the happenings of our parsha. Oh, I forgot to say one thing about Yiftach, which is he is a complicated character. Actually, I think we'll skip it. We'll move it to later. So, okay, jumping right in. Yiftach is the deliverer. He is the shofet at this time. How he gets there is interesting, right? The Haftarah is from Pasuk Aleph Aleph to Lamed Gimel, and I gave you Yud Bet. So the beginning is a lot of character development about Yiftach. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But here is the connection. So just like Moshe, Yiftach is confronted with outside forces that are either aggressive towards him or he's trying to sort of move into the right spot in the land and they're getting in his way. And just like Moshe, he sends messengers to them. He doesn't go he doesn't attack right away, right? So, Vayishlach Moshe Melachim, jumping around a little bit from our Haftarah, Moshe sends messengers to the king of Edom. And here, Vayishlach Yiftach Melachim El Melech Bnei Ammon. Yiftach sends messengers to the king of the Ammonites. And both of them are asking a question where they're saying, like, calm down, right? I'm not looking to start a war. I just want to get through, right? You're in my way. I want to get through where you are. Don't start war with me. And finally, Yiftach says to the king of Ammon, he says, listen, we didn't do the things you're accusing us of, right? Yiftach says Israel did not seize the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, right? The king is saying, listen, you came in and were aggressive, so we're being aggressive back. And he's saying that's just not the case. And then he references our parsha, right? Ki ba'alotam Mitzrayim. As we left from Mitzrayim, vayelech Yisrael b'midbar ad Yam Suf vayavo Kadesha. Right, and we Bnei Israel went from the Yam Suf, from the Sea of Reeds, and went on to Kadesh. And then, sure enough, right, Moshe sends his messengers mi Kadesh el Melech Edom. Right, so right now, Yiftach is talking about this moment in time from Bamidbar Perek Kaf, chapter 20, verse Yudalid. And he says, so what happens when we got to Kadesh? We sent messengers to Bnei Edom saying, please let us through, right? Which is exactly what you're going to see, right? Moshe is saying to the king of Edom right here in our parsha. And just like Moshe, Yiftach is taking this moment to offer some kind of history lesson, right? So Moshe tells the king of Edom about how we Vayerdu Avotenu Mitzrayim, right? That his forefathers went down to Egypt. V'nei shev Mitzrayim Yamim Rabim, and they stayed for a long time. V'yera'u lanu Mitzrayim v'la'avotenu. Right, and the Egyptians were bad to us. They dealt harshly with us and our ancestors. And then, right, he recalls the miracles. V'nitzak el Hashem v'yishma kolenu v'yishlach malach v'yotzeinu miMitzrayim. And then we called out to God, right? It's sort of reminiscent maybe of the Haggadah in some way. And God heard our calls and sent an angel, a messenger who freed us from Mitzrayim. Sort of an interesting retelling, whether the Malach frees Bnei Israel or God frees Bnei Israel, but a telling of our history. V'hine anachnu b'kadesh ir k'tzei gvulach. Right, and here we are in a town on the border of your territory. And Moshe really doesn't want to do anything but pass through, but Edom says no, and so in the end, we have to go to war with them. So now back to our Haftarah, right? That's like part A of our history. And now Yiftach is picking up at the point in which is present day for Moshe, right? He says, so we sent messengers to Edom asking us to pass through, right? Avrana Bartzecha, v'lo shama melech Edom, right? That's what we'll read in the parsha first. V'gam el melech Moab shalach v'lo ava v'yeshev Yisrael b'kadesh, right? And also they sent a mission to the king of Moab, and he too refused, right? So after staying at Kadesh for a long time, we had to travel on, right? We had to skirt those lands. And he says, listen, we kept to the east of the land of Moab until they encamped on the other side of Arnon. And since Moab ends at Arnon, right, now he's talking very technically about the land and the borders. They never entered the Moabite territory, right? He's saying, you're accusing us of old war crimes that we didn't commit. And so instead of just going to war, just like Moshe could have gone to war, he tries to help this external enemy in the land understand why they're doing what they're doing. And so it seems like because Yiftach mentions Moshe's story, right, the same story that we see in our parsha, that's the connection. As I said, I don't find it such an interesting connection, but it is certainly a strong connection to our parsha. And if you're sitting in shul and you listen to the parsha, then you listen to the Haftarah, it's interesting to sort of hear that echo. And to realize how closely I think the narratives fit one another, right? It's sometimes when we tell our national story, it gets diluted or muddled over time. But Yiftach really says exactly what Moshe says, which is interesting. So that's the strongest connection to our Haftarah. But the second one, which is going to touch on the much more interesting dilemma of this week's Haftarah, is that it seems like Yiftach is in some way echoing a vow or the pattern of making a vow as you go out to war. So in our parsha, in Perak Kaf Aleph of Bamidbar, it says, "Vayidar Yisrael neder laHashem." The whole of Bnei Israel, the nation, made a vow to Hashem. What did they say? Vayomar im natan titein et ha'am hazeh biyadi v'hacharamti et areha. If you deliver this people into our hands, we will prescribe their towns. So Bnei Israel is saying, if you help us win, right? Hacharamti, like we'll put them in chayrim. We'll set them aside. And it seems like it's like that, like when you're running late and you say, God, if you make the light green, I'll go to mincha every day next week, right? It's like a deal that they're trying to make to sweeten the pot for God to do what they want. And Yiftach, and again, you can see just the very strong echoing of language from the parsha to the Haftarah. V'yidar Yiftach neder laHashem, exactly the same formula as in our parsha, almost as though perhaps Yiftach has heard of this practice of making vows as you go out to war. He also makes a vow to God, which would be great, except Yiftach, who is a work in progress, who is more deliverer than leader, makes a very, very bad vow. Right? What does he say? He says, Vayom. Im naton titain, right? Again, this very, very similar language to our parsha. Im naton titain et bnei Ammon beyadi. If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, v'haya hayotze asher yetze midalte beiti likrati b'shuvi b'shalom mibnei Ammon v'haya laHashem v'halitanu olam. He says, if you deliver the Ammonites to my hands, then whatever comes out of my door of my house to meet me on my safe return from Bnei Ammon shall be God's and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering. So the text goes totally, the commentaries go totally wild, trying to figure out why Yiftach would make such a weird vow and what it's all about. Because actually, our Haftarah does not go into the consequence of this vow, but it felt unfair to leave it hanging here without talking about it. Unfortunately, tragically, who is the first person to come out of the door of his house when he returns home but his daughter? And Yiftach, for reasons that we don't understand, sticks to his vow. He doesn't try to annul it, which is like a whole masechet of Gemara and Mishnah devoted to figuring out how to annul vows. He offers his daughter as a sacrifice. It's a really sad and tragic story for so many reasons. So, okay, so I want we could have spent a whole day just talking about this, and I didn't think that was right because we should look at the connection to the parsha. So I want to share a few thoughts, and then we'll look at a few thoughts inside the text as well. So the first thing is that those first 11 psukim that I skipped in our Haftarah talk about how Yiftach comes from a questionable heritage. It seems that his mother is a prostitute, perhaps, and his father has some questionable history. And Yiftach himself is actually exiled into this like wild west of Israel, where there are people of questionable repute, and it falls into bad company, perhaps. And when Bnei Israel comes to him, asking him to be their deliverer, saying, "Hey, we know you're a really good fighter, and we want you to fight on our behalf with Bnei Ammon," he's very, I think, understandably what my chavruta would call salty, right? He says, "No, where were you when you sent me out into this, Badlands? I don't want to be here, but I also don't want to fight for you anymore." And Bnei Israel has to really sweet talk him into coming. So he has this sort of coarseness to him, perhaps not of his own making, that he was sort of exiled from the people at first. But we also know that he's like a fierce and scrappy fighter, right? Because he's good enough that the people want him to come back and fight for them and lead them into battle. But he lacks that finesse of a leader, right? That maturity, that forward vision, right? It's if some of the midrashim say, like, who did Yiftach think was going to come out of his house? Right? Some of the midrash says, well, maybe it was like he thought that like an animal would run out to greet him. And then the midrash says, well, no, but animals don't come through your front door, right? He made this really strangely specific vow, Yetzei midaltei beiti, from my front door. And so the midrash says, no, it couldn't have been an animal. Then there, I think, is an equally horrifying idea that he thought there would be a group of groupies of young women who would come out to meet him, and just one of those young women he would offer up to Hashem, which makes you wonder, did Yiftach understand what God really wanted, right? God doesn't want human sacrifice, as we know, but someone who might have heard the story of the Akedah and not understood it, right? A piece of our history in which God seemed to ask for human sacrifice. Maybe Yiftach thought he was doing that. And so maybe he really did think his daughter was going to be the first one to come through the door. It's very unclear. And I would say that the vow being part of the end of our Haftarah, right? We have two more psukim after this one, without the consequence, perhaps makes us want to think that Yiftach is a good guy, is a strong deliverer at the very least. And in fact, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says the super interesting thing. I left the beginning because, interestingly, for Judith and for Sherry, who were here last week, this first little chunk of the Gemara we talked about last week, right? That Shmuel is perhaps on par with Moshe, right? We say there's no Navi like Moshe, but Shmuel is somehow lumped in there. And we talked last week, perhaps it's because of Shmuel's ability to be a flexible thinker. He didn't want there to be a king, but he was able to sort of come around and do that. And then the Gemara goes on to say, Shakal hakatu shlosha kalei olam kishlosha chamurei olam. That in this manner, the verse weighted three light ones of the world, i.e. less distinguished figures, to the three significant ones, the three heavier ones, the heavyweights, Moshe, Aaron, and Shmuel, right? So in Tehillim, Moshe, Aaron, and Shmuel are the heavyweights. Who are the lightweights? You can see Rashi would have helped us out. Gidon, Shimshon, and Yiftach. And interestingly, Shimshon is the next shofet after Yiftach. Right, so these are considered the light ones of the world, which I think the Gemara is saying, listen, Yiftach is not such a great leader. However, right, and this also touches on this idea of, reminds me of Parshat Noach, right? Noach was a tzaddik b'dorotav in his own generation. And so here it says also, right, this comes to tell you that Yerubavel b'doro, Bedan b'doro, right, that Yerubavel is, Kamosha b'doro is like Moshe, Bedan b'doro, Aharon b'doro, and that Bedan in his generation was like Aaron and his. Yiftach, our star of the show, b'doro k'Shmuel b'doro, that somehow Yiftach and Shmuel are being put on equal footing. Lilamdech she'afilu kal shebekalin, even the lightest of the light, the least distinguished individual, the worst leader, Parnas al Hatzibor, Harehu Ka'abir She'abiram. That once he has been appointed the leader, he must be treated like the greatest of the great, and all are required to heed and obey his rulings. So I think this is a super hard Gemara. I don't bring this to Yiftach's horn, but to say what a fascinating lesson the Gemara is trying to teach us here, that once Yiftach has been appointed a shofet, he must be great. I don't want to stray into politics. I'll just say this reminds me a little bit of the question of like the office versus the person that I think we are grappling with in not just America, in perhaps even in Israel, right? At what point do we say this behavior is not befitting the office, right? Making a vow, a reckless vow to kill and offer up the first thing that exits your house is not befitting of the office of the shofet, one might say. And yet, once they are appointed a leader, they have to be treated like the greatest of the great. So on the one hand, I think there's enormous stability in this teaching, right? We don't always get the best leaders, but if we don't honor and respect their office, it becomes difficult to run a country, which is exactly what we see the people saying to Shmuel in the next parsha, in the next Haftarah, in last week's Haftarah, right? It's not enough to have a series of kind of so-so shoftim that get treated as the greatest of the great. We actually need to have a system where there's a monarchy that is the greatest of the great, right? That's what the people are asking for in last week's Haftarah. So I think we're stuck with Yiftach. He's a shofet, for better or worse. It doesn't seem like he was being bred to be a shofet. It doesn't seem like the people thought he was going to be such a good shofet, but they needed him to be their deliverer. And so they're stuck with him because once they appoint him, he becomes like the Abir Sheba Abirim. So, I don't know what to make of that, but to say that the people, the Gemara struggles very mightily with why Yiftach would make such a vow and why he would not choose to annul it or even try to annul it. So just a quick piece of Gemara here from Masechet Ta'anit. The rabbis are talking about questions, unreasonable questions that receive unfavorable answers. And so not surprisingly, Yiftach's question features here, right? That two of them are God, for whatever reason, Hashivuhu Kehogen, responds reasonably. But to one, which we know is Yiftach, he responds Keshelo Kehogen, not reasonably, unreasonably. And so what is that case? So I'm just skipping over the stories of Eliezer and Shaul. That's right, going from paragraph 4 to paragraph 7, the way that Sefaria works it out. So they say, right, so they go through those two cases where they have unreasonable requests, yet God meets them favorably. By contrast, with Yiftach HaGiladi, God is not going to respond favorably. So they say, what was the unreasonable request? It is no surprise, it's from our Haftarah, V'haya hayotzeh asher yeteh midaltei beiti v'chulei, right, that whoever comes out from this house will be offered as a burnt offering. And interestingly, what is the problem the rabbis of the Gemara have? Yachol afilu davar tameh. What if a pig had walked out the door? Right? It's not that chas v'shalom, a person should walk out the door, but he just wasn't thinking straight is the issue of the Gemara. How could he have promised anything when not everything is fit to be sacrificed? And so what happens? Hishivu shelo kahogen. God responds unreasonably. Viniz damna lo bito. And his daughter happens to come across him. So I think this also, right, is a fascinating statement that God somehow is repaying Yiftach's poor judgment by causing his daughter to walk through that door. I don't know what that says about what the rabbis thought about God. I think it's a super difficult theological question. Why would God choose to punish Yiftach by killing his daughter, right? What did his daughter do? So it's hard to imagine for me. But the Gemara asks here regarding this incident, right? We take a break from this question of unfavorable responses to say, why did Yiftach not try to have his vow annulled? And they do that by quoting this pasuk from Yirmiyahu, where they ask, like, why has no one healed the person in question in Yirmiyahu, right? Is there no balm in Gilad? Is there no physician there? And the Sefaria helps us out. Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not recovered? So that verse alludes to the fact that had he sought a means to do so, Yiftach could have had his vow annulled. And here we can see that God clearly doesn't want this. Is what the rest of this Gemara is coming to say. Is through some psukim we're seeing that God does not want human sacrifice, and it makes clear, even if Yiftach was confused, let's not be confused. The Akedah story was a test. It was not ever intended to be an actual sacrifice of a child, right? Maybe Yiftach thought, oh, just like Abraham, I too will have this amazing thing. And God, in his in God's way of making it clear that Yiftach made a mistake, God offers the daughter as like the example, the lesson. So again, I think it's very difficult, and the Gemara is grappling with it, but they don't have an answer. And just the last text I want to look at before I would love to hear everyone's thoughts and questions and ideas here, is the Midrash Tanchuma from Bechukotai, where it's talking a lot about Pinchas, a lot about Yiftach, I mean, also about Pinchas. Pinchas is the Kohen Gadol. Pinchas is the person who probably could have annulled the vow for Yiftach, had Yiftach said that. And the Gemara imagines, right? Ela Pinchas Amar. What would Pinchas have said in this case, right? Like, imagine, right? They're saying, V'halo Pinchas hayasham. You imagine Yiftach riding in, his daughter comes out, and Yiftach's face falls, and he goes, "Oh my gosh, what did I do? Why did I say the first thing that walks through the door? I don't want to sacrifice my daughter, right? Let's hope that that's what he thinks." And so the Midrash says, "Well, wait a second, where's Pinchas? Pinchas could have solved this whole problem. Presumably, the Kohen Gadol and the deliverer, the shofet, come in at the same time. V'hu omer lo uchal lashuv." But still, he said, and I cannot retract. And so it says, Ela Pinchas Amar, Ani Kohen Gadol ben Kohen Gadol ve'ech elech etzel ha'am ha'aretz. It seems that Pinchas is saying, I am this great person, right? The Kohen Gadol, who is the son of a Kohen Gadol. I'm not going to humble myself and go ask Yiftach if he wants to annul his vow. That's not appropriate. Let Yiftach come to me, is sort of what we imagine the Midrash is saying. Yiftach Amar. So then they say, well, Yiftach, just go to Pinchas, right? What would he have said? Ani Rosh Shoftei Yisrael, Rosh HaKetzinim. I am the head of the tribe of Israel and the head of the magistrates. Ashpil atzmi ve'elech etzel hedyot. Would I go and humble myself by going to a commoner? And so it's almost like a story of Chelm or something, right? They're imagining these two men are too proud. They've totally forgotten what's at stake. No one is going to let their pride fall. And so the Midrash is clear. Mi bein tarvehon, between the two of them, avdat hahi aluvta min alma. The two of them were liable for her, between the two of them, that poor woman perished from the world. And right, and as if that was not clear enough, ushnehem nitchayvu b'dameha. The two of them are liable for her blood. And then, it seems that the Hebrew got cut off, but what the Midrash says that the consequences of these two men being too proud is that the Ruach HaKodesh left Pinchas. He became an ineffective Kohen Gadol. He didn't have God with him. God was so disappointed in Pinchas's inability to come to Yiftach that God left Pinchas. And Yiftach does not have a final resting place. He's not buried respectfully, but his bones were scattered. So I think the Midrash, in a way that the Gemara does not seem willing to do as forcefully, is saying Yiftach really messed up here, right? He made a stupid vow, fine, but then he allowed his pride to get in his way and not to fix the problem. So I guess all of this is to say that I think it's interesting that this piece of the story is left in. Like, it might have been a neater Haftarah, and it would have been possible because you only need, I think, what did we say? 27, 29 psukim? I don't remember exactly, but here we could have ended at Pasuk 29, right? At Pasuk Kaftet. I don't know if they left it in because the vow parallelism was like too strong to pass up, or if there's something about Yiftach's vow and sort of this not sitting right that somehow does feel like it aligns to our parsha. I don't know what it is. We don't read the whole story, so maybe it really is just about the vows matching up. But I think there's something very troubling that's going on here, and I'm not sure if it's a comment on the parsha or just happens to be a part of the story, and they don't have a choice but to leave it in. Maybe I'll just end by saying that I did see a beautiful idea that offering her up to Hashem meant more like the way that Shmuel's mother offered Shmuel to Hashem. that she was like consecrated to God in some way. And so although it may be terrible in the sense that like she was forced to enter like the covenant, as it were, sorry, is that what they're called? Where the nuns live, where she had to be secluded from people. She couldn't have children and be married, but at least she wasn't at least she wasn't offered up like in Greek mythology on the altar. And so you don't have to end the story as harshly as the Midrash does, but the Midrash certainly is following the pshat of the text. So I don't know. I would love to hear what you guys have to think, because I think this Haftarah is tricky because it leaves the door open to think about this problematic vow. But I think that in part it's just that, and perhaps like Moshe, who hits the rock, right, in this week's parsha, who doesn't get to go to Israel, maybe there is some small comparison to leaders who fail in difficult times, or to leaders who make poor choices that lead them to fail in difficult times. But to compare Moshe to Yiftach feels very unfair to Moshe. So I don't know. Please save me from myself. Yes, Judith. You're muted.
The book of Judges is a fascinating and complicated affair, and it's very negative in tone, both at the beginning and in the beginning of each section about a different judge. It talks about the Israelites, thriving for a bit, at least having peace for a number of years under the previous judge, and then they start falling away and worshiping idols and, forgetting all the vows they made when they got saved, and things go from bad to worse. And then there's a progression throughout the book that as each successive judge gets more and more flawed in different ways. You mentioned that, did you mention that Yiftach is at the center?
Yes, that's right.
And it is a pivotal point, among other things, because the previous judges, at least they had some kind of a relationship with God, and so does Yiftach. He speaks to God, he makes the vow. But then it's clear, as with several others of them, that being an effective warrior and leading people in battle is not the same thing as governing the tribe after the battles are no longer necessary. And so he's kind of in the middle and gets himself into a mess. The succeeding judge is Shimshon, who is consecrated, by his mother, by angels, whatever, and seems to be preparing in the right way to be an effective spiritual leader, except that you never hear a word about Shimshon having much of a relationship with anybody, including his parents. There's no real mention of God until the end, where what he's asking of God is what he's been seeking all along, which is a sort of adolescent lust for getting back at the people who have in a way isolated him and made him into someone without connections, without an ability to connect, whatever. There are lots of things there. But what I'm saying is each successive judge seems to get further away from the fundamental principle of Judaism, which is connection and bonds of love that govern every single positive relationship, and in the small, person to person, bonds between the members of a tribe, so you feel like one unit, and the bonds between human beings and God ultimately is what makes the Am Yisrael what it is. And bit by bit, people are falling away, and they're electing leaders who can't help them. They save them in battles from their lusty neighbors, but that's it.
Right.
They last 20 years, and then it's back on the downward spiral.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it to me again it's an interesting choice to read a Haftarah from the book of Shoftim, Especially when, as I said, it's like not a very inspired connection to the Parsha, because it is a difficult book. And it's difficult to read any stories, right? I think when we read about some of David's children, I wonder the same thing, like what do we hope to learn from these negative examples that seem to be put in front of us? It's a great question.
Well, I think it's incredibly relevant to our times, as it prods us to ask, what is more important in a leader than his personal character?
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah, I think it's a good point by Judy. I was thinking of the relevance, the wars of today and the complications and the different currents going back and forth. And it's so confusing, you can't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
The other thought that I have was comparing the Akedah to the challenge to Ichtach. Abraham had some humbleness, but he also could challenge God. Ichtach had only ubri and no trace of humbleness, and how he solved the sacrifice. It's I am confused. I am puzzled. I think you guys gave a good summation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it really resonates today in terms of being at war and sort of the ethics of war, but also feeling like this dearth of moral leadership or visionary leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tamar.
Hi. On another subject, I was puzzled and intrigued by some wording way back when we were reading the description by Moshe of their time in Egypt. And he said, speaking of the Egyptians, he said, they dealt harshly with us and with our ancestors. I thought, Lanu v'la'avotenu, I think. So, whoop,
I'm pulling it back up for us. Yeah.
okay. Oh, you got
Right. This is where we were.
right away at the beginning when Moshe was.
Yes, here. Vayareu lanu mitzrim v'la'avotenu.
That's just it. That was it. Lanu v'la'avotenu, but those are two different generations. You know what I mean? That was interesting. Vayareu la'avotenu. Why
Yeah.
lanu v'la'avotenu?
Yeah. Well, and truthfully, Lanu is like really only applies to Moshe at this
Right.
right. He's really the last one. Moshe and Miriam and Aaron have died, I think, at this point. But even if not, then the three of them. But everyone else, it's their avotenu. They were never in Egypt, right?
Right.
And so maybe if Moshe is speaking on behalf of the people, it's actually a stretch of the truth to say that Egyptians dealt harshly with them. So it feels like they have to include Vila Avotenu because they were never in Egypt, right? This is the Dor HaMidbar. Or maybe it's a connection even back a little bit further, right? To say we want to lump ourselves into the generation that left Egypt, but La Avotenu, to our right, to our actual, the 70 souls that came down to Egypt, those Avotenu were treated harshly in Egypt. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
I'd go with that.
But I think that also, Tamar, that also highlights such like an important question about today, right? Which is like, how far back do we allow these narratives to run, right? Because our great-grandparents suffered at this point, we have agency to do this thing, right? Or our great-great-great-grandparents suffered at some other hands. We have agency to do something else. Like at some point, we have to say, we have to talk about what happens to us, Lanu, right? Not just La Avotenu. And figuring out where those lines are, I think, is very tricky. right? And because what's Yiftach doing is like, on the one hand, he's giving a history lesson. On the other hand, he's pulling up like bygones that are now being pulled out to show that they're behaving properly at that moment. I think that, those narratives are tricky. National history narratives, right? It's hard to know how to tell them and who's included and who's not.
At the same time, this is nothing new. The previous judges, Gidon in particular, went through a similar scenario, pointing out to would-be enemies and invaders that they were wrong in saying that the Israelites were encroaching on their land. It was the other way around, that their people had taken that land away from somebody else not all that long ago, et cetera, et cetera. But Gidon at least managed to express this more diplomatically and somehow come to a better result than the following judges. Anyway, it's an ongoing problem here as each occupying tribe thinks they've been there forever. And I think what stands out for me in these particular narrative scenes, where they're kind of bargaining or trying to persuade their would-be aggressors that they're not necessarily in the right, that the Israelites seem to be oriented toward talking their way out and toward maintaining memory and using the memories of the past to help establish their position, as at least in this narrative, the other peoples are not doing. They're not countering by saying, oh, you're not right, we did this, we did that. We have a claim to this land after all. Already a nation of lawyers.
I think it is, it is a complex Haftarah for many reasons. I appreciate teasing out some of those earlier reasons as well. And a complicated parsha in a lot of ways. So maybe in that way, they're a good match together. But I hope it gives us things to think about at the very least in Shul as we listen to the Haftarah. And I will be in town this Shabbat, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as I can at Shul.
We look forward to it, and I was hoping that you're set up for meals. I know there was
I am, yes, thank you.
Okay, very good.
And I hope everyone has a good rest of their week, and I hope to see you, if not in person, next week on Zoom. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, bye.